Hi, my name is Katie Takiyanagi, and I'm a fellow of Orton-Gillingham. I have a small Orton-Gillingham teacher training and tutoring practice called Alphabet City Tutors, and I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, but I work with teachers and families in different parts of the country and sometimes even in different parts of the world. So I thought it might be helpful to create a few videos to answer questions that I commonly get either from families who are interested in Orton-Gillingham tutoring for their children, maybe because friends or teachers or a neuropsychological evaluation have recommended OG, or teachers who are interested in pursuing training but don't really know that much about it. So I thought it might be helpful just to have this as a starting point to give you some basic information about what Orton-Gillingham is. So I'm going to talk about the origins of Orton-Gillingham, also known as OG, the principles of our OG instruction, parts of an OG lesson, and programs derived from OG. So the origins of Orton-Gillingham, Orton-Gillingham is named after two individuals, Dr. Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham. So Dr. Orton was a neuropsychiatrist and a pathologist, and he studied individuals with reading difficulties, and he was really pioneering in this field. This was in the 1920s. Based on his work with these young people, he felt that there was the potential for them to learn how to read and to be successful with the right instruction. So he developed some teaching principles for what this effective instruction would look like. And he really sort of pinpointed this idea of a specific language disability that these individuals had. He partnered with Anna Gillingham. She was a master educator and a psychologist, and she had a very in-depth knowledge of the English language and was really able to break it down into its component parts so that it could be taught in an effective way gradually over time. And she helped to develop what the format of the lesson would look like for young people with dyslexia, and also what teacher training would look like. So Orton-Gillingham has really been around for quite a while, and it's always been based on a merging of science and medicine with education and psychology. And although it's such an old approach, over time, as practitioners, we stay very current in relevant research on the brain and learning and reading in particular. And we have really amazing tools now that show exactly what happens in the brains of individuals with dyslexia who have not had the right instruction or the right amount of it, how that's different when those individuals are reading than what is activating in the brain of someone who doesn't have dyslexia. And then also we can look at the impact of instruction like Orton-Gillingham over time and how that actually really changes the brain. So we have a whole sort of extra layer of support now for what Orton and Gillingham knew just from their observations of the young people that they were working with, and not even just young people, but adults as well. So they are the people for whom Orton-Gillingham is named, although there are other, people, colleagues they worked with even very early on who made huge contributions to Orton-Gillingham. But it's already a mouthful, just the Orton and the Gillingham. So that's where the name comes from. Our instruction is based on a set of teaching principles. This comes directly from the Orton-Gillingham Academy website. If you want more information about these principles and sort of more explanation of what each one entails, you can go to the website, and there are some excellent descriptions and diagrams for some of them. So just as a basic overview, at the top of the list, Orton-Gillingham is diagnostic and prescriptive. Your Orton-Gillingham practitioner will know enough from their in-depth training and their experience how to observe everything that their student is doing in the lesson, all of the things that come easily to the student, all of the hesitations, confusions, errors, and can analyze those to be prescriptive in how they're going to plan the next lesson based on exactly what happened in the previous lesson, even how to direct the rest of the current lesson. So the lesson is always being tailored and adapted to the needs of the individual student, which segues into the second principle, that our teaching is individualized. So not only in terms of being diagnostic and prescriptive, but anything else about the learner's profile, background, culture, interests, even just how they're feeling on that particular day. All of that gets factored into how we as practitioners design and teach each lesson. Our approach is also language-based and alphabetic phonetic. So at a most basic level, it's structured explicit phonics, but there's a lot involved in being fully literate beyond just phonics. There's morphology, there are other language structures. But what we don't do is just have students memorize words. We really teach them about the structure of the English language and the history of the language in ways that help to sort of explain why things are spelled the way that they are. And it's all rolled out over time incrementally in a way that makes sense so that students really understand the language, understand the alphabetic code, and understand phonics to help them read and spell. We also practice simultaneous multisensory instruction, meaning that we engage multiple senses. Obviously, reading is very visual, also auditory. We have students listening to dictations for spelling or also listening to themselves as they're writing, they're verbalizing. So visual, auditory, also kinesthetic and tactile, meaning movement. So we'd have students do things like finger tracing on textured surfaces for that movement, that kinesthetic, and also tactile, like sensory reinforcement. Even just physically writing is a kinesthetic task, or moving your mouth is also a kinesthetic task. So we have students incorporating multiple senses at once because it stimulates so many areas of the brain, and it actually really helps with learning and with retention and retrieval of information. Our instruction is also direct and explicit. So that doesn't mean that there's no room for inquiry or for play, but ultimately, we really want students to know exactly the information we want them to know. We want it to be very clear. We don't want them to just have to infer and leave it at that, because many of our students, they won't get there, or even if they do, it just won't be direct enough for them to retain it, because once we've taught it, we also need to repeat it and give repeated practice and be very explicit. Our work is structured, sequential, and cumulative, but also flexible. So we do have a structure to our lesson, although there's room for flexibility depending on the needs of the student. We do go in a sequence. We have to choose an order of what to teach, but there's no one set scope and sequence that all OG practitioners follow, or even each practitioner might follow a different sequence depending on the needs of that particular student. Our work is cumulative, so we don't just teach something and then move on to something new. We're constantly reviewing and building on the knowledge of the student to make sure that the new information we've taught is integrated into what they already know. Otherwise, it's just going to be forgotten as we move on. And again, it's flexible, it's customized to the needs of the students. We're also doing synthetic and analytic work. So synthetic meaning synthesizing, putting together. Like when we read, we blend sounds together. And analytic meaning breaking apart. So when we spell, we have to break words apart into individual sounds or syllables or morphemes, and that is part of how we figure out the spelling of a word. Our work is cognitive. So we don't just, again, teach kids to memorize spellings or memorize what words look like. We really explain the structure of the language, spelling rules and patterns, different types of syllables, so that students have the knowledge to think things through. They really depend on that to, over time, become very secure with the information that we've taught them. And our work, really importantly, is emotionally sound. So just by following all of these principles, it really supports the emotional health and well-being of our students. We are always just sort of keeping things to what we've taught the student and what's fair for us to expect the student to be able to do based on what we've taught in our lessons. And so we can ensure that the student is successful at the same time that they're being challenged to continue learning, but we really set them up for success and go at their pace in our instruction. So in terms of what happens in an Orton-Gillingham lesson, it's going to look a little bit different depending on the age and the skill level of the student, but we do have the same basic parts, pretty much regardless of who our student is. So we have sound to symbol work. So I'm sorry, symbol to sound work on the left-hand side. This is really kind of supporting reading that starts as symbols on the page, and then we put it into sounds. So we have our phonogram drill where we hold up cards that have different letters and letter combinations on them, and students very quickly can tell us the sounds that they've learned for those spellings. We have students reading words that are phonetically controlled for the skills that we've taught them. We go up to moving on to sentence reading and then oral reading of connected text once students are able to access that, beyond the very early levels. So we're always going from part to whole. We're working on reading skills. But then on the right-hand side, we also really care about spelling. So the sound to symbol, the reciprocal of all the reading skills, we do lots with spelling. So just like our phonogram drill is a visual drill looking at spellings and the student saying sounds, we also have an auditory drill where we dictate sounds and the student writes down the spellings that they've learned from us for those sounds. Students work on spelling words, sentences. We also want to develop their written expression skills so they don't just learn to be strong spellers, but they also learn how to organize their thoughts and express them clearly in writing. And we teach reading and spelling of words that are phonetically irregular. That's not the main gist of our teaching. We are mostly teaching regular patterns because that's what's going to be the most effective for our students, but they do need to learn to read and spell words that don't follow those phonetic patterns as well. And again, we're really doing holistic teaching. It's not just about phonics. It's not just about being able to read and spell words. There are other skills that we teach, such as handwriting, which actually really is an important part of spelling success in particular, and spelling and reading go hand in hand. So handwriting, although it might seem a little bit superfluous or not as important, actually is an important part of our lesson. We teach phonological awareness, which has to do with students being able to identify and manipulate the sounds in words. So for example, to hear that there are 3 sounds in the word cat, for example, k, at, or to be able to blend together those separate sounds into a word, to be able to identify words that have the same sound at the beginning or the same sound at the end, things like that. So again, even though that's not actually directly a reading or spelling skill, it actually really supports students' progress with reading and spelling. So we do some of that work alongside the reading and spelling work that we do. And we're also working with students on developing their vocabulary and reading comprehension. Ultimately, we want them to be really strong comprehenders, really strong writers. So we work on all of these different parts that feed into those kind of bigger skill areas of comprehension and expression. Lastly, I just wanted to briefly touch on, there's sometimes confusion about what is Orton-Gillingham versus what are programs based on Orton-Gillingham. So there are a lot of programs that you have likely heard of that are derived from OG or based on OG, sometimes created by people who were trained in OG. So for example, Wilson is really widely known, and then the classroom program Foundations, those were developed by an Orton-Gillingham fellow, Barbara Wilson. PAF is another reading program based on OG. Barton, Linda Mood Bell, Lips, there are actually many, many more. I just wanted to pull out some specific names that people might recognize, but some of these programs are created just as a way of teaching whole class reading. That's the whole class reading curriculum. And some are programs that are designed for small group or for one-on-one reading intervention. We as Orton-Gillingham practitioners are a little bit emphatic about saying that if you do traditional Orton-Gillingham, you're doing an approach. It's not a program. A program really has to be sort of crystallized into a specific scope and sequence. Some programs have specific lessons pre-written, and really, as Orton-Gillingham practitioners, we follow those teaching principles that I described earlier so that we have a lot more flexibility than someone does within the structure of a program. So this is not to say that programs based on Orton-Gillingham are not good. there are many great programs and great practitioners of these programs, but we as traditional Orton-Gillingham practitioners, again, we kind of can flex our scope and sequence depending on the needs of the individual student and really tailor everything to the individual student, which requires being diagnostic and prescriptive in a way that a program just doesn't allow for. So we tend to think of, when we say we're trained in Orton-Gillingham, I'm an Orton-Gillingham Academy fellow, so I do all of my trainings according to the guidelines of the Orton-Gillingham Academy. Some people will say that they're trained in OG when they're referring to one of these programs that's based on OG, but it's a little bit different from what we do, essentially. So I hope you found that helpful, just at least as a starting out point as you learn more about Orton-Gillingham. I'm happy to talk, email, answer any questions that you might have if you're considering tutoring for your child, if you're considering getting trained in OG yourself. You can visit my website at www.alphabetcitytutors.com. You can reach out to me. Here's my email address, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks.